All right. Hello, everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Folks are still joining us, but let's make the most of the hour that we have. Just to let you know, my name is Spencer. I work for Mary on the campaign, and I'm going to kind of be moderating our conversation here today. But just as some general housekeeping items, just make sure to keep yourself muted throughout the conversation. That way we can hear the answers clearly and we don't get interrupted by background noise. And then if you do have a question, we're happy to take those throughout. Just use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Click on that, type in your question, and we'll continue to take those. We also have questions that were pre-submitted, and so we're going to go through those. We'll kind of start with those, and then as you guys have questions and they arise in the conversation, we'll start taking them from the chat too. So just as a reminder, for that reason, make sure that you are muted. Your mute button is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Just make sure it has the red slash through it. And so just to turn this over to Mary. Mary, why don't you give us your introduction?
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you everyone who has joined and continues to join this town hall tonight. You have been so engaged with me over the last few weeks. This is our last town hall before the primary on June 2nd. So we have 12 days to go to the election, and I'm so appreciative of the great questions you've been raising with me and the way you've been engaged. So we were excited yesterday to see a new poll come out, which showed that I am tied for first place in this election with Sheila Dixon and Brandon Scott close behind us. It is a tight race, and we still have a lot of work to do. This independent poll showed that 22% of voters are still undecided. So we have a lot of work to do before June 2nd to bring those voters into our camp. And I will be working as hard as I can to win this election. As you know, this is a mail-in election for the first time in our history, and ballots have still not been received by many voters in the city of Baltimore. So we're watching that carefully to make sure that people get their ballots and have time to vote before the postmark date of June 2nd. If you haven't received a ballot, you can always call the City Board of Elections and ask for a ballot. You can also contact the State Board of Elections to make sure that your address is correct. And you do that by going to www.elections.maryland.gov. So make sure that you are armed with a ballot. Make sure that you sign the back of that ballot, that you get it in the mail or to a drop-off center by June 2nd. And of course, I hope you're voting for me. I wanted to use our time tonight to just talk briefly at the beginning about what the economic impact of the coronavirus will be for Baltimore, and then spend time just taking your questions. I'm most interested in hearing from you now and engaging with you, so I won't talk too long. I'll say a few things at a high level, and then let's get right into questions. Looking at the healthcare impact of the coronavirus is one thing. Looking at the economic impact is another, and it has been enormous for the city of Baltimore. As of today, 62,000 city residents have filed for unemployment insurance benefits. That is more than 10% of our population. And before the coronavirus, we already had a 5% unemployment rate. I don't think it's a stretch to say that today we likely have unemployment over 20% in the city of Baltimore. When we turn the lights back on this economy, some of those people will get their jobs back and many will not. I expect that we will have double-digit unemployment for some time in the city, and we need to be prepared for that and what the income impacts of that will be. We already have an eviction rate in Baltimore that is 2.5 times the national average, and we have a homeless population that is conservatively estimated at 4,000 and is likely much higher than that and will grow. Because we have some bad cliff effects here, by the end of July, unemployment insurance benefits are scheduled to run out. The city and the state, in some measure, has provided some temporary deferrals on rent payments, on evictions. But as these things end, we're going to be putting a very harsh burden on people in Baltimore, and particularly our most vulnerable populations. So I have been saying that the city needs to get ahead of this with a big safety net plan to provide safe and transitional housing for people who may lose their housing, and to be very geared up to provide assistance to small businesses and people looking for work in Baltimore. I've said repeatedly that we should be going very hard after the federal dollars that are available for cities like Baltimore. The CARES Act at the end of March included as much as $103 million for Baltimore to pay for COVID-related expenses. And there's more discussion about how cities can benefit from federal aid to replenish lost tax revenues. We should be very attentive to that because this is going to be hard for Baltimore to do on its own. I also talk about the fact that in the CARES Act legislation are specific funds for public transit systems, including the use of those funds to declare a fare box holiday. This is something I think Baltimore should do for the rest of 2020. We need to work with the state to do that, but I think that could be very helpful for people who have been out of work for months and are coming back to work or heading back to school. Let's take that pocketbook issue off their plate. I think that could be a very helpful program for Baltimore. I also think the city should be thinking carefully about how to use its own budget stabilization reserve to help small businesses get through this period. By designing small business loan plans, by doing more with small business grants. We can't afford in Baltimore to lose those businesses and the jobs that are attached to them. So I am suggesting that the city work hard on developing that safety net plan for what's likely ahead, and particularly as we think about the winter of 2020. I also think that coronavirus gives us a unique opportunity to solve one big problem in Baltimore, which is the digital divide. Before this pandemic started, we knew that 40% of households in Baltimore did not have access to the internet, something that many of us just take for granted, many of us on this call right now. Another 75,000 households in Baltimore, close to that 40% number, did not own a tablet, laptop, or computer. Because of the crisis, we've made enormous strides on the hardware. We have provided between 20 and 30,000 Chromebooks and laptops to students studying at home, and we did that in a matter of weeks. I think we should use this opportunity to close the gap on hardware, but also to close the gap on internet access. We have many temporary fixes right now through the Enoch Pratt Library, through mobile units, through mesh networks that have been set up on rooftops. Let's figure out what the cost would be to provide internet access across the city, and let's use that opportunity to get that done. Because if we can connect people to the internet, it's going to be easier for them to do job searches. It's going to be easier for them to use telemedicine. It's going to be easier for students to learn at home. I think this is a unique opportunity to do that. And there is a whole coalition of more than 30 organizations organized now into the Digital Equity Coalition. And I think this is a signature project for Baltimore. Longer term, what I'd like to do in the city is mount a very ambitious program to sell vacant houses in Baltimore. The city has languished with 16 to 17,000 vacant properties for more than a decade. I think it's time to say we're going to sell 10,000 houses in 4 years, beginning with 1,000 in 2021 and ramping up to 4,000 in 2024. This is a huge asset that the city's sitting on that could be used to revitalize property, bring those properties back on the tax rolls and generate more property taxes, solve our affordable housing problems in Baltimore by providing more homes to people as either rental or home ownership. And the proceeds of selling those properties could be used to do something that I call the Baltimore Works program, to put to work unemployed residents in the city, working on some of our most important environmental and infrastructure projects in Baltimore, and perhaps also working on the renovation of these houses. I would recommend selling the houses to local developers, small developers, community land banks, and community development corporations who have been begging for access to these houses. We need to remove every barrier to the sale of these properties and getting them back into productive use. I think that could be an economic development program on its own. So I have on my website a program that I call Inclusive Growth that lays out everything that I would like to do to drive growth in Baltimore and make this city prosper. I encourage all of you to read that, and I'll stop here in terms of some broad comments about economic recovery in Baltimore. And let's just go to questions.
Yeah, so we have some pre-submitted questions that folks have submitted. We'll start with some of the pre-submitted questions regarding the economic recovery from COVID, but please, as I mentioned before, feel free to mention or ask your questions in the chat. If you just head to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the little icon that says chat. Click on that and type your question in there. We'll take those throughout. So the first question we have, Mary, related to recovery is, African Americans and low-income residents have suffered more because of this pandemic. There was an economic disparity prior to the outbreak. So how can we promote job growth and job training in the wake of this?
I'm not surprised to see the effect of this pandemic on our most vulnerable populations. We already knew that they had much higher pre-existing health conditions that would make them much more exposed to the virus. We were slow to put testing facilities in place. We created barriers like requiring a physician referral, having to pay for a test. We needed to move much more quickly to get into these communities, locate the testing centers, and provide free testing to people. So this is a very unfortunate outbreak, the outcome of the coronavirus on our most vulnerable populations. Baltimore's residents reflect the high degree of poverty this city experiences. 1 in 4 residents in Baltimore live below the poverty line, which makes them so exposed to things like a healthcare outbreak. I think the solution is to come in with a very broad objective of raising income in the city of Baltimore to give people access to healthy homes, to health care, to jobs, to income that can give them so much more agency in their lives. I call this mobility from poverty, and there's well-trod evidence about what the factors are, what are the things we need to do to move people out of poverty. We have not made any progress on this issue in Baltimore, and I think that we can. One of the topics I would explore that I've talked about is much better workforce training in Baltimore that reaches down into our high schools and into our prisons to help people who have found it impossible to find meaningful work, to give them that work and that opportunity. We have over 30 workforce training programs in Baltimore that are not well connected to employers that need employees. I can't stand it when I hear about a good job in Baltimore that's empty because the employer says they can't find someone to fill that job. We can do a much better job at the city level of being the coordinator of workforce training and our employment base. And if our workforce isn't ready to work in those jobs, then it's on us to educate them and train them so they are ready. But I think the way to avoid a healthcare pandemic inflicting so much damage on our most impoverished and vulnerable residents is to give them the income and the work so that they're not living in that situation.
Excellent. Now, you touched on this a little bit in your opening, but we have a question here about the digital divide. It says, when you are mayor, how will you ensure that thousands of households in Baltimore City who do not have internet service in their homes get it? Without that access, how can people find out about jobs, apply for jobs, and how are children in these households keeping up with schoolwork? It's even more of an issue now. It is wrong that so many households lack this service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've already talked about that a little bit, but you're just exactly touching on what I think is the opportunity that we could address right now. There are really 3 parts to this. One is devices, getting them in the hands of households, whether it's a laptop or a Chromebook or a computer. The second is the connectivity, and that could be wireline or wireless access. That's where I think we have a big job to do. Cities that have done that have shown a direct improvement, a direct economic benefit of providing connectivity to their local economy. because you're allowing people to be part of the global economy, to be in the workforce, to be teleworking, to working from home. So there's an immeasurable benefit to doing this, and there's a huge equity issue in providing this to the parts of the city that don't have that. All of the reasons why are elicited in that question. Applying for jobs, children studying at home. I've mentioned telemedicine. I think that this is really our obligation as a city to solve this problem. Other cities have done it. There are various models for doing it. I think we can do this.
Great. I'm going to turn to the chat for a minute and ask a few questions from there. Greer's asked, could you explain a bit more about your Baltimore Works program? Is it a training program or something different, especially given the plethora of workforce training programs already?
This is actually a jobs program, and I think it should be city run to put people to work on projects the city wants to do. Let's take an example of an environmental project. I'm very excited about the idea of expanding the tree canopy in Baltimore. If we can put more trees in neighborhoods without trees, we can lower the temperature differential in the summer between a neighborhood without trees and one with trees. That's very important for a number of reasons. One, public health. People are less ill if they aren't living in overheated houses and neighborhoods. Two, air quality. Trees can capture particulates in the air and clean up the air and make it healthier. Three, we improve the aesthetics of neighborhoods in addition to that. But this is a program that is not terribly high skill, but one that would be very valuable to do across the city. And we're not spending very much money on it. I looked at the 2021 proposed budget. We're spending $4.5 million in our urban forestry program. I would do more of that, but that's an example of a job that we could create that could give people work to do. I think there are other environmental projects, stormwater waste management, designing capture basins in neighborhoods so stormwater isn't running off all the way down to the harbor and polluting our harbor. These are, not terribly expensive projects, but they can improve the quality of life and environmental issues at the same time. We could go on with infrastructure projects in Baltimore that go wanting. Let's put people to work doing them. I think that would be an investment in our physical infrastructure that would pay benefits for our job creation and for our economy.
Great. Now we have another question in the chat regarding education coming out of the crisis. It says, whenever there is a crisis in this city, the first cuts always come to education. Our students have already suffered for years in under-resourced schools. Less than 15% of our city budget goes to our schools. Our kids need more funding and not less, especially with the digital divide, remote schooling, and there will be a huge need for mental health resources for students who have suffered during this time. What will you do to improve schools?
So I'm a strong supporter of the Kirwan Commission recommendations. I do agree that this has not been a high priority in the city's budget. I do understand that a lot of the funding for our school system comes from the state, but I think the city can do more. And I've been clear that I will make this a priority and I will find the funding, not just for the operating costs of our schools, but also for the capital costs to improve the physical facilities of our schools. This is where we can use our capital budget more aggressively to help improve the quality of public education in Baltimore. I think that's one of the highest obligations of a city government. We do not do a good job today of educating our children well or putting them in facilities that are well equipped to teach. I've been to some of the new schools that we have built under the 21st Century Cities construction program, 21st Century Schools construction program. They are beautiful. Any parent, any family in Baltimore should want their child to be in one of those schools. But we need more schools like that. So I think that's part of our long-term objective to improve Baltimore as a city by improving our school system. How are we going to do that financially? I just keep coming back to the same point. We need to drive a very strong economic development program in Baltimore that is going to strengthen our tax base, increase our income tax revenues, and provide us the revenues that will allow us to do the things we need to do in Baltimore.
So I'm going to jump back over to some of our pre-submitted questions. We have a question here that says, what is your plan for helping small businesses get back on their feet once the stay-at-home order is lifted?
We have put on our campaign website, I call it the one pager, but it is every financial resource that has been offered up for small businesses since the coronavirus began. Some are grant programs, some are loan programs, some are at the city level, the state level, and the federal level. So we hope that's a handy resource for small businesses that are looking for support. But I am quite concerned that as we come out of the coronavirus shutdown, we will have lost a number of our small businesses in Baltimore. Take the example of restaurants. If you need to cut down on the number of tables in your restaurant to allow for more social distancing, that can dramatically increase or decrease your revenues and make your business hard to manage and be profitable. I've already seen a few restaurants close for that very reason. So I think we're going to have to be pretty creative in solutions and thinking about how can we help small businesses morph in ways that they can still be a profitable business. I think the city can be more friendly to small businesses. I'm an advocate for taking our today very small business resource center and really lifting that up with the help of the private sector to create a much more open architecture resource center that is going to put every type of assistance a small business needs to grow here in one place. That should include licensing and permitting, for example. It should include technical assistance on business plans. It should include legal and accounting assistance. And most importantly, it should include financial lenders that can help small businesses grow. I think that we could put together a much more helpful way for small businesses to grow in Baltimore. I think we make it hard to be a small business here, and I think that needs to change.
Absolutely. So this is our last pre-submitted question related to recovery, but then I'll move back over to the chat and ask a few more of those. This question says, for several days, the world's top analysts have admitted that the old rules will not apply to the entire economy once we figure out how to test everyone and then slowly reopen the economy. They say they have no basis for figuring it out. What unique piece of insight would you offer them as a citizen who is way smarter than the average bear?
Well, there's a lot in that question. I guess what I would say is we're really thinking about how people are going to work in the future. Let's take Baltimore as an example. Before the virus, we had a 20% vacancy rate in office buildings downtown. Now we have run a major experiment of people working from home and teleworking. I suspect we're not going to fill those buildings back up to where they were before. We need to think very hard about the industries of the future and what all this means in terms of space usage and how we can repurpose space in ways that's going to be economically productive. When I talk to bankers, they're very concerned about commercial office space. I think that's a big question from here. So I think our job is to think about the future of work, if you will, and how we can make that more possible. Again, come back to the digital divide. If we're not providing internet connectivity to people to work from home, we will be cutting off a major segment of our population. But I think that's probably the big one, the physical occupation of buildings and the way we work around each other is probably going to be changed permanently. And that's one of the things I think about a lot.
So I'm going to jump back over to the chat. Dick has a question here that says, the city currently has a hiring freeze. How would you deal with that in terms of current staffing at the Department of Housing and Community Development and other affected agencies and your proposed new or revamped up initiatives such as Vacants to Value?
Mm-hmm. I think the Department of Housing and Community Development is under-resourced for the task at hand. The massive program I'm talking about in terms of property transfer is going to take a lot of people working on the legalities and the process of doing that. In the short term, I have said the city should be tapping this municipal liquidity facility to help stabilize the budget over the next 3 years while we put these programs into place. I personally think this is not the moment to be furloughing people and laying off city employees into an already saturated job market. So I would keep employees in place. I would try to particular areas, add staff where we're going to have an economic benefit from doing that. You know, the cost, for example, of vacant housing has been estimated by the Community Development Network, a very good organization doing work on this, that the cost to the city every year of vacant housing is $72 million in lost property taxes and the cost of servicing these properties. What if we could take that cost back from the city? Wouldn't that pay for many jobs in the Department of Housing and Community Development? I think so. So I think we need to be more strategic in thinking about where do we want to put more jobs and where can we hold ourselves harmless and just keep, not hiring. I'm eager to look through, all of the city's staffing plans to see where can we find efficiencies and where do we need to put more. I don't think it's a good idea to have sort of a one-size-fits-all approach because there are parts of city government where we absolutely need to put more resources.
Great. So now I'm going to kind of broaden our scope a little bit and ask some more general questions about your policies and ideas. First, I'm going to take a question here from the chat from Aaron. He says, DPW departments provide basic critical services to most major cities and communities. What emphasis will you place on DPW services and the reform and modernization of the agency to ensure that Baltimore has a functional water billing system, clean, well-lit modern streets, well-kept parks, and better recycling?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the greatest areas of frustration among city residents is the inefficient, ineffective, and inequitable delivery of city services. We can all talk about the cybersecurity attack last year that shut down city government for a couple months. We can talk about the water billing issues. We can talk about the fact we haven't collected taxes from companies like Uber and Lyft. This calls for a much stronger management hand at the top. I would put in place a strong deputy mayor system in the mayor's office. And one of those deputy mayors would be a deputy mayor for operations that would be completely accountable for the efficient, effective, and equitable delivery of city services. We have got to get on top of our water billing issues. We've got to get on top of our technology issues. And importantly, we need to have a better risk management function in city government so we're not surprised or caught off guard. We had cut funding for emergency health management, and now we're paying the price for that. I think that having more management, talent, and skill and structure in the mayor's office is the first step towards that. In terms of the Department of Public Works, they have a very big job in Baltimore. Many neighborhoods say they want to go back to 2 times a week trash collection. We may need to do that in certain areas, but I think we also have to mount a big waste reduction plan in Baltimore. Try to use recycling and composting more effectively. Close the Bresco plant on Russell Street to improve air quality. But before we do that, have a good plan for our landfills to make sure that we know where waste is going. I think that we can do a lot more to be a modern city. We can improve our street lighting, we can improve our safety, we can improve on trash collection, but also things like illegal dumping, which are a big problem in Baltimore. So the Department of Public Works should be, applauded for the job that they try to do every day in Baltimore, but they need more help.
So I'm going to move back over to some of our pre-submitted questions, kind of with a more general scope. As you know, crime is always kind of at the forefront of our minds. And so this question asks, Mary, you say you will support the police commissioner, Michael Harrison, in his efforts to reform the Baltimore Police Department. Commissioner Harrison is credited with reducing violent crime in New Orleans during his tenure there, but has now been in office in Baltimore for 1 year, and at least prior to the pandemic, we have not seen reduction in violence here. Why do you think that Mr. Harrison has the experience and the capacity to reduce violent crime in Baltimore?
Well, I have read his plan and met with Police Commissioner Harrison, and I know that he got this done in New Orleans. I'm not saying that New Orleans and Baltimore are identical, but we have a proven leader who reduced violent crime in that city and resolved a consent decree, which we need to do in Baltimore. I also talked to the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, who said, you have the right person You just need to give him the support he needs to get the job done. In one radio interview I listened to this year, Michael Harrison was honest in saying, we can't do this overnight. This is going to take a couple years. And I think people were broadly frustrated by that. But that is the reality. We have some very enough, and not particularly in the homicide rate in the city. But I think he's on the right path. And I'm eager to give him the support he needs. I have not seen elected officials give him enough support and coordinate the support across all of the agencies that touch criminal justice issues in Baltimore. That's what we need. And I think that with that support, I think that he can be effective. But we can't have any more turnover in the police commissioner's job. We went through 5 police commissioners in 5 years. And that is certainly not a recipe for successfully executing any plan. So I've read all the crime plans, I've read his plan, every candidate's plan. I think that we have a commissioner who deserves the support to get the job done here.
So our questioner here also had some follow-up to that. She had asked, what impact do you expect a reform of the Baltimore Police Department to accomplish in regard to reduction of violent crime in Baltimore? And what will you and Commissioner Harrison do to reduce violent crime in Baltimore that's different than what has been done in the past?
Well, in the past, we have had some effective strategies and we walked away from them. I think we need to identify the most effective strategies, and then we need to implement them and stay after them with continuity. One example would be something called focused deterrence, where you put a lot of your resources towards the most violent offenders to stop them from reoffending. That requires working with the Department of Parole and Probation, working with juvenile justice, having tight coordination between the police department and the criminal justice system, working with the state's attorney's office. We need to do that to go after the small number of offenders that are creating a disproportionate number of crimes. We also need to work on violence de-escalation. We have good examples like Safe Streets, like ROCA, like Ceasefire, that have been proven to reduce crime by stopping it before it starts, working with youth to turn them away from violent crime. We do this sporadically. We fund and defund, and we often don't do it at high enough scale in my mind. So I would like to use those strategies. I also think that we really need to modernize technology in the police department. ComStat, the police department's technology database, is a 1990s system that needs to be brought forward into the 21st century with better data on community data matched with police data. We can make our police officers more productive. We can respond in real time if we have better data and technology to do that. So I think we need to get help to make sure that we've got the most modern systems. And I could ask the private sector for help with that if we're not getting it done quickly enough in city government. But I think those are some of the things that we need to do to make this police department more effective.
So going back to the chat, Tom has a question here that's regarding vacant housing. He says, Baltimore's huge inventory of vacant houses has not declined over the last 10 years, as newly abandoned properties have about equaled the numbers of removed. The population continues to decline. Among other things, the city's sales of tax liens to investors to collections has been called a non-best practice, which conveys $1 to $2 million to them. Do you foresee policy changes to pick up the pace of blight removal to make Baltimore more consistent with other post-industrial cities?
Absolutely. I picked up the newspaper at home last week and there was an insert of the tax lien sales. These are properties that have unpaid taxes. And the city, by my count, had close to 15,000 properties listed in a newspaper insert that you needed a magnifying glass to look at. And I looked through that, and these properties will be offered for auction in July. Before you get there, many property owners will pay off the tax lien, so they won't actually go to auction. But it's a very cumbersome process of having another party pay off the tax lien and then begin a legal process to try to take title to that property. We absolutely need to clean that up and make it much simpler for the city to transfer properties more quickly into new hands to get them revitalized. So I'm eager to follow the best practices that you are identifying to see how we can do this better, because we have this quagmire of houses that just get stuck and nothing changes. And each year that goes by, a vacant house becomes less valuable and harder to renovate. Some of them cannot be renovated. They're going to have to be taken off the rolls. We're going to have to deconstruct them, repurpose all of the materials from taking down that house in environmentally good ways, and turn the property back into community for more open space and more productive use, and perhaps reconstruction on the same property. But we need to get smarter and faster and more effective in this. When I looked at that newspaper listing, I also noticed how low the assessed valuations are on so many of these homes and what little value they're giving the city here. This is an untapped resource. In fact, I think there are two untapped resources here. One, the properties that go begging for investment, and the people that go begging for jobs and work. Why can't we put those two things together?
So we have another question here in the chat regarding recovery. The question is, considering that the hospitality industry is the second largest industry in the city next to healthcare, what is the plan to jumpstart the convention tourism industry post-corona?
Yeah. I have to be honest and say that is going to be a slow recovery, because people today are very risk averse about travel, about social distancing, and about congregating in large numbers. We have already shut down some of Baltimore's hallmark summer, events, Artscape in July, for example. We've pushed back many sporting events into the fall. So this is going to be a slow recovery, but I think a good marketing campaign for Baltimore as we recover, highlighting our many attributes and attractions as a city, will be called for. I think that's a role that the city should be playing to make this place a destination. But I think we need to be honest that this isn't going to be a quick recovery.
So I'm going to jump back over to some of our pre-submitted questions. This is one I don't think that you've been asked before. This question is, can you please discuss the steps you will take to gain the support of those city officials and the city who may not have supported your candidacy?
Well, on June 3rd, or whenever we get the results of a mail-in election, I will be reaching out to people across city government. I don't assume that I would win the general election in November, but it would be a high probability. And I already know a number of members of the city council. I already know a number of people running city agencies. I already know elected officials in different capacities. It's time to start building the rest of those relationships to make sure that we're going to have a productive partnership. We cannot afford to have, bickering and competition between the city council and the mayor's office and expect this city to succeed. I also think that we need to build strong bridges with the state and the federal government, because Baltimore cannot go it alone. I have had a lot of experience putting together coalitions of people to solve problems. When I worked in the Obama administration, I often had to convene people of different political parties, people of very different stakeholder interests, to try to put together solutions on problems we all wanted to solve. And I think by listening to every stakeholder, taking into account what their concerns are, their issues are, you can begin to put that together. But we can't afford in Baltimore to be at odds with each other. I think we need to work together. And I will be someone who will do that.
So speaking of your time in the federal government, what about your experience at the U.S. Treasury persuaded you that Baltimore needs a new perspective and direction before some of our problems can be solved?
I may have already said this, but I don't think that Baltimore takes enough advantage of the federal programs that are out there. And I use the example of several times calling the city while I was working at the Treasury Department and saying, here's a grant program that you would be eligible for. I'll help you. And not getting any response. We leave things on the table that I think we should be going after much more aggressively. I also saw other cities that were much more engaged. I spent a lot of time working in Detroit after they filed for bankruptcy. while I was in the government and worked very closely with them on how they could tap federal aid, how they could, break down barriers to investment. Last year, I read that Detroit's tax base had grown by 20%. We haven't seen anything like that in Baltimore. So I think that sort of purposeful use of relationships with other levels of government could be very good for Baltimore, but we need to put the resources in place to do that. I already talked about building a strong deputy mayor model in Baltimore. One of my deputy mayors would be intergovernmental relations, to make sure that we have very strong bridges to places that can help us. And that includes the counties around the city of Baltimore.
So going back over to the chat, Lisa is asking, how do you propose that we fund these ideas? We are in desperate need of a reduction of property taxes, considering that Baltimore County's property tax rate is half of the city's. How can we make Baltimore competitive and still fund these new initiatives?
I have said that I will commit to lowering the property tax rate in Baltimore. I think we need an entire review of our tax structure, of how we're raising money for city government. Where are we giving it away with tax incentives, tax credits, and pilots that we should be clear need to be giving the city a benefit in return for that credit. When I see as many tax credits as Baltimore offers to property tax owners, that's telling me the property tax rate is too high if we have to keep introducing new tax credits to get people to buy and invest here. So I don't think our tax revenue system is built correctly, but I come back to, and this is the how are you going to pay for it part of your question, is the importance of driving a very strong economic development program in Baltimore. We need investment in the city that is going to strengthen our tax base, allow us to lower the property tax rate by growing into that. If we can grow the base, we can lower the rate. We also, by creating more jobs in Baltimore and good jobs, living wage jobs, we can raise the income base in the city and derive more revenue from income tax revenues. The reason it's so critical to do that is because there are things we need to do as a city. We need to make those investments in our kids through education. We need to make those environmental investments to improve the quality of life in Baltimore for many of our residents. And we need to invest in the most disinvested parts of the city to lift everyone up here. I have been clear from day one that I think we have to go after every vestige of structural racism in this city and inequality and make sure we are greenlining Baltimore to give the areas that have been left behind the opportunity that they deserve. So that's why growth is so important. That's why economic investment is so important. And that's why leadership is so important to make this happen.
So I know we have a little less than 15 minutes left and we have a lot of questions left. I just want to reassure you all that if we don't get to your question, you are always welcome to send us an email at info@alexmarymiller.com and we'll make sure that we get an answer to you. But we will try and get through as many as possible tonight. Mary, Peter wants to know if Turnaround Tuesday could play a role in building out some of your workforce initiatives.
I love Turnaround Tuesday. This is an organization that helps people who've left prison get back into the workforce. I've sat through one of their training sessions and it's inspirational. Turnaround Tuesday, at last count, had created 800 jobs for people who have prison records. That is an admirable feat, but we have thousands of people in Baltimore who need work, who have prison records. So Turnaround Tuesday, I think, is a shining example of what we need to do with our returning citizens to give them meaningful work and get them reconnected to community. So yes, I love the work Turnaround Tuesday does. I've been involved with the Center for Urban Families for decades. We're just not doing it at high enough scale. What I say about Baltimore is we're holding bake sales all over the city that are well-intentioned, but we need the supermarket. We need to do things like that at much higher scale to really move the needle on some of our poverty issues in Baltimore.
So returning back over to our pre-submitted questions, this is a question I see you get a lot. They ask, how will you go about selecting, vetting, and securing the best candidates for the deputy mayor positions? What characteristics, traits, experiences will you be seeking, and will they be required to live in the city?
Mhm. So both in the public sector, in the federal government, and in the private sector here, I spent decades hiring people, building strong teams, and building very effective teams, I think. What I look for when I search for people is I want people who have direct experience in the areas that they're going to be managing. I want people that have a demonstrated record of success, that they're not just talking about it, they've done it, and they can show me measurable evidence of getting that job done. I like team builders. I don't like stars. I want people that are going to give credit to the people that work for them and around them and are going to be leaders in building strong teams. And I also want people who have a sense of urgency about solving problems. Those are probably the most important characteristics to me. And I've also been very clear in talking about my team in City Hall that I will build the most diverse group of leaders that look like the city of Baltimore. And yes, I want them to be city residents. I've been a city resident for 34 years, would not live anywhere else, and I want my team to live in Baltimore too. And that's something that we need to strive for across city government employment. We talked earlier about Police Commissioner Harrison and his needs. He's got a big human capital need, and I'm eager to work with him on recruitment, hiring, training of police officers, but I also want more police officers that live in the city of Baltimore.
Well, Mary, you didn't even know it, but you just answered another one of the questions in the chat regarding police officers living in the city. We have another pre-submitted question here, which is very similar to a question that Jason is also asking in the chat. So the question says, in the face of the city's problems, Baltimore struggles to attract major companies to open new facilities or to move into existing ones. Moreover, politics has slowed much needed investment, like the State Center project. What creative solutions do you have to make Baltimore more competitive and attractive to industries looking for a new place to open offices or to move their operations?
Well, this comes back to my main point of this has not been a city that has been, in my words, hospitable to growth, and we need to change that. I talked earlier about creating a small business resource center that would be an open architecture site, a big site, to help small businesses move through the process of starting up here, growing here, and being successful here. I think we can do a better job on business retention. We're losing businesses from Baltimore. The city should be all over that. We should be calling up businesses that are here and saying, what do you need? How can we help? I think that is the role of city government in terms of economic retention. I also think that we could be a better incubator. We have a number of business incubators in Baltimore. I think the city should be all over that. How can we provide good environments for businesses that need a place to locate? Are we working well enough with our Baltimore Development Corporation to connect businesses to sites in Baltimore, to places to locate, the most affordable, the most cost effective? I would say we need to do that work on our tax structure to make sure that it is business friendly in Baltimore and that businesses can locate here. I think those are some of the key elements to being more supportive and more friendly to business. And of course, I have to come back and say, we need to resolve our crime problems in Baltimore too. I think it's a pretty heavy lift to get businesses to come to Baltimore unless we can show demonstrable progress in reducing crime in Baltimore, which makes keeping the businesses we have today even more important.
So going back over to the chat, Judy is asking, first she's saying, studies have shown that adverse childhood experiences affect health in later life. Would you consider that support for our lowest income residents needs to go beyond jobs and income, but also require a holistic public health push to address a range of needs?
Sure. I have a paper on my website that talks about public health disparities in Baltimore. And one of the things we're recommending is getting the Department of Housing and the Department of Health to work together. Healthy homes can be a very big contributor to resolving some of our public health disparities, but keeping kids in school. We have a very high asthma rate in Baltimore. We also still have lead paint problems in our homes, which create terrible issues for children over the course of their lives and learning. So I would connect housing and health in a way to do home inspections, to make sure people are living in healthy situations, particularly children. Now, the Kerwin Commission is recommending more preschool education. I totally support that. But children have to be healthy if they're going to be able to go to school. And when I talk to school principals, it's really alarming how many days of school are missed by children in Baltimore. And a lot of it is healthcare related. So yes, I would support a more holistic approach to healthcare, particularly for children, so they can learn.
So our next question is about climate change. It says, climate change has been described as a local issue that has gone global, that those most effective have had the least input into the formation of the problem. What new actions do you propose to mitigate the environmental injustices borne by Baltimore's economically disadvantaged?
This is a big conversation going on in Baltimore today around environmental justice in our city, because some of our poorest communities suffer the worst effects of poor air quality in Baltimore. Talked about temperature differentials in certain neighborhoods. We need to tackle these issues and make sure that where you live doesn't determine your expectancy and your health, as much as a 20-year life expectancy differential between some of our wealthiest neighborhoods and some of our poorest. And that is fundamentally wrong. We can close the Brusco incinerator and improve the air quality of people living near that plant. That will help. But we also need to do a lot more with waste reduction in the city, get after illegal dumping with more code enforcement, perhaps use of cameras to stop that type of environmental injustice in our neighborhoods. I think that we should be doing much more with building codes in Baltimore to make buildings healthier and safer for people. So I think there's some enforcement issues here. There's some waste management issues here. There's air quality issues here. But I think there's a big equity issue here, that the worst evidence of environmental justice is falling on our poorest residents. And that's something that we need to change. But fortunately, there are many people who are engaged on this topic. I've had the privilege of meeting with many of them and thinking about some of these solutions.
So Mary, we have less than 5 minutes left. I have 2 more questions for you and then we'll wrap up. The second to last question I've got is, how would you address Baltimore's problem of thousands of working age adults who lack high school diplomas or have low reading and math skills? Or they have diplomas but still can't meet employers' required reading and math levels. These people, many of whom who are past the age of 18 to 24, that's usually discussed, are shut out of jobs with families supporting their wages. What would you do to change that?
We can't turn our backs on people just because they've aged out of schools. I think that we need to do a lot more, again, with the workforce training programs that are in Baltimore to give people connection to work. But I think there's some other things we can do too. Community schools, for example, have a very big role by providing support for adults and parents, perhaps with GED classes that are offered in those schools. This is using a school that's used during the day for teaching students, but can be used in the evenings and weekends to provide more services to the families and people that need services. So I think that might be one place to locate more support for people who do not have work and don't have the skills. But I think this is an obligation of the city to come back and serve the people that have been shut out of our economy and haven't been given enough opportunity. So I'm eager to see how we can use workforce training differently. I meet people all the time who say, I have 12 job training certificates, I've never gotten a job. That is not effective in my judgment. And I think we have to have that tighter connection between a real job and a real training. So this would be a hallmark of the economic development program for Baltimore, but also thinking about how we can use some of our existing resources better.
So Mary, our last question for tonight will be, You have such great experience at the federal level. What do you say to people who say that you do not have enough Baltimore City political experience and would have to start from ground zero in terms of understanding the political system and players here?
I say that I am a political outsider to Baltimore. I have not been part of the political system of local government, but I actually think that's exactly what we need right now. I will be the most independent mayor, not tied to anyone, no baggage, coming in with a fresh perspective and a ton of management experience, particularly in the government, working in the federal government, that I think could be very useful to Baltimore at this moment. I also say that I am no stranger to Baltimore. I've lived in this city for 34 years. I've been involved in the community in so many different ways. And I've been so impressed with how the nonprofit sector is serving our city. But I can't sit on the sidelines any longer without seeing meaningful progress. I can volunteer. I've been painting houses in neighborhoods across Baltimore for decades. I can serve meals. But I'm not seeing the progress. We've been promised a lot of things, and I'm still waiting. That's why I think right now we need someone who's not part of the current political environment to step in and shake things up and start moving in a different direction. That's what I want to do.
So Mary, as you know, we recently shared super volunteer Lisa Wen's video asking city residents to say Mayor Mary Miller 3 times fast. So Lisa wants to know if you can say Mayor Mary Miller 3 times fast.
I like to say M's cubed, M3, but I'll try. Mayor Mary Miller, Mayor Mary Miller, Mayor Mary Miller. There, did it.
Perfect. Hopefully we'll get used
Yes,
to that
for people
sound.
to do it 5 times though. That's even harder.
Well, hopefully we'll get used to that sound and we'll be saying that a lot more soon. Thank you everyone for joining. Mary, if you just want to give us a few closing words, that would be great.
No, just my deepest thanks. This has been one of the most rewarding periods of my life. I jumped into this race on January 7th. It's now a mere, I guess, a little more than 4 months later. We've made amazing progress. So I'm really excited about the opportunity in front of us. I know it's going to be a fight to the finish line, but I want to win this race because I want something better for Baltimore. And I think all of us do. We all want the same things for our city. We want to be proud to live here. We want a city that is firing on all cylinders and delivering on its mission. And I think that is entirely possible. So I thank you for your attention, for joining tonight, for your great questions. And I look forward to June 2nd.
Thank you all. Just so you all know, we will have a recording of tonight's town hall available probably by Monday. If you are not currently subscribed to our newsletter, I would recommend doing that to make sure it comes directly to your inbox and you can forward it on to all of your friends. You can do that at electmarymiller.com. You can also sign up to volunteer there and be sure to tell 100 people that you're voting for Mary. So thank you all and enjoy your night. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.